Hello and welcome back. Today we're exploring 5 overlooked historical murder cases. Let's dive right into the stories. 1. The murder of Mary Ellen Coro. Born in 1844 in County Sligo, Ireland, Bridget Danion arrived at a particularly difficult time. Ireland was experiencing what would later be called the Great Famine, and her county was facing severe hardship. A poor potato harvest left many families unable to feed themselves or meet even their children's basic needs. Consequently, when she was old enough, Bridget left Ireland on her father's orders and embarked on a journey to the United States in search of better opportunities. It wasn't long before Bridget Danion found employment with a New Jersey couple, Dr. William Coro and his wife Mary Ellen, as a servant and wet nurse on October 22, 1866. She took care of their household and their 2-year-old daughter, Mamie. Dr. Coro, a former Civil War soldier, was also treating Bridget for catalepsy, a neuromuscular disorder that can arise from shock or severe trauma. Despite her condition, the Coriels initially viewed Bridget as a competent servant, especially appreciating her kindness toward Mamie. However, living with the family soon turned into a nightmare for Bridget. While the arrangement began positively, with the Coriels paying her well and trusting her with their daughter, Bridget soon misinterpreted the doctor's kindness as affection. She developed an infatuation with him and began contemplating Mary Ellen's demise, having grown to resent her. The two women were frequently at odds, with Mary Ellen often harshly criticizing what she perceived as Bridget's filthy habits. Tension escalated as Bridget's feelings for Dr. Coro deepened, leading to even more conflict between her and Mary Ellen. After 4 months of service, Mary Ellen fired Bridget because her medical condition prevented her from performing her job duties. Bridget's dirty habits also angered Mary Ellen. The Coriels agreed to dismiss Bridget, who became unhinged after her termination. Although she despised Mary Ellen, losing her job sent Bridget into a maniacal rage. On February 25, 1867, Bridget worked her final day for the Coriels. She spent the day seething with hatred and anger towards Mary Ellen. Later in the evening, Dr. Coro left home to deliver a baby in a nearby town. Bridget Danion then decided to murder Mary Ellen Coro. Mary Ellen was roughly 5 feet tall and weighed 100 pounds. She would be no match for Bridget's violent assault. The angry servant grabbed a butcher knife and stick. She beat Mary Ellen with the stick and stabbed her several times with the butcher knife. In the evening of that day, Reverend Charles, a neighbor of Dr. William Coro and his wife Mary Ellen, was at home relaxing until someone began knocking on his door. It was a cold and snowy evening in Newmarket, New Jersey. The Reverend opened the door to a barefoot woman, Bridget Danion. She held a baby in her arms. Bridget shared her story that 2 men had broken into her home and murdered her employer, Mary Ellen Coro. After beating Mrs. Coro to death, the men set the house on fire and was fortunate to grab the baby and fled. The couple was well known and respected in the community. When locals saw the Coro house ablaze, they rushed to offer their help. One witness reported that thick black smoke billowed from the building. Upon entering, he discovered the lifeless body of Mrs. Mary Ellen Coro, who had been brutally stabbed and beaten to death. Bridget informed the authorities that she had seen 2 men outside the house around 8:30 p.m. They had left and returned 2 hours later, and Bridget claimed they had broken in with the intention of robbing the family. She described one man as tall and the other as short. Initially, Bridget identified the 2 men as strangers, but later she implicated 2 local residents, Michael Hunt and Brian Doyle. Then she changed her story again, blaming a servant from another household, Anne Lennon, for Mrs. Coro's murder. Shortly after, she switched her accusation to an Irish woman named Mary Gilroy, who, like Bridget, had emigrated to America. Authorities quickly ruled out Hunt, Doyle, and Lennon as suspects, focusing instead on Bridget Danion as the likely murderer, with Mary Gilroy as a potential accomplice. A newspaper report revealed that the victim had suffered over 20 gashes, bite marks, and patches of hair torn from her scalp, along with numerous bruises, indicating that Mary Ellen had endured a painful death before dying. To eliminate evidence, Bridget subsequently set the house on fire. The Reverend also noticed a blood stain the size of a handprint on Bridget's white skirt. Additionally, she reeked of kerosene, which made her a suspect in the arson of the house. After concluding their investigation, Authorities charged Bridget Denon with the murder of Mary Ellen Coro. A letter published in the New York Times described Bridget as an immoral and inhumane woman devoid of any beauty. The trial drew significant public attention, as women rarely committed such brutal acts of violence. On May 31, 1867, Bridget was found guilty and sentenced to hang, showing no visible reaction to the verdict. Authorities concluded that she acted alone after she informed them that Mary Gilroy was not an accomplice. Following the execution, the crowd was allowed to view her body. Prior to her death, she wrote a confession letter in which she admitted to killing Mary Ellen Coro, revealing that she had planned the crime well in advance. Several newspapers published the confession, though the details varied among them. After her execution, the media depicted Bridget as an illiterate monster. While she was convicted, some believe that police may have coerced her into writing the confession, though this remains uncertain. Today's historians consider the case closed, attributing Bridget Denon's actions to a combination of obsession and hatred that drove her to murder. 2. The murder of Mary A. Hitchcock Wakelin, Marie Antoinette. Hitchcock Wakelin was a prominent temperance reformer, born on April 28, 1834, in Rodman, Jefferson County, New York. She was the only daughter of Lorenzo Dow and Arilla Barnes. At the tender age of 11, her family relocated to Wisconsin, a frontier region that was still developing its educational infrastructure. This move marked the beginning of a challenging journey for Mary, as she navigated her formative years in an environment that offered limited schooling opportunities. In 1852, Mary married Alfred Hitchcock, yet she continued to teach for a time after their marriage. Her husband was ordained as a minister in 1857, and together they embraced a life dedicated to the service of their community. However, tragedy struck as both her husband and father passed away, leaving Mary to shoulder the burdens of grief and responsibility. Despite these hardships, she became increasingly active in reform movements, ultimately serving as district president and vice president at large for the state organization. In 1894, Mary remarried Wilson Wakelin. However, there were persistent rumors suggesting discord between the couple, hinting at underlying tensions that would later culminate in a tragic event. On the night of the murder, around 11:30 p.m., S.P. Robertson, a local farmer residing near the Wakelin home, was abruptly awakened by a frantic knocking at his door. Upon opening his window, he discovered Wilson Wakelin in a state of distress. He informed Robertson that his wife, who had been suffering from illness for some time, had taken a turn for the worse and urgently requested that Robertson fetch his son-in-law to get a doctor. Wakelin's demeanor suggested he was in significant emotional turmoil, prompting Robertson to quickly make his way to the Wakelin residence. Upon arrival, Robertson noted a light illuminating the sitting room, but found the house eerily quiet. On the table, he spotted a chilling note that read, 11:05 p.m. am going to kill Mary. 11:15 p.m. have cut her throat. She is entirely dead. You will find me at the cemetery. Alarmed, Robertson rushed to seek help. When authorities arrived at the scene, they discovered Mrs. Wakelin lying on her bed with her throat gruesomely cut. The severity of the injury had severed her windpipe, yet the scene was strikingly devoid of blood. Most of the blood was found in a slop jar, suggesting that Wakelin had attempted to clean up after the act. A search party quickly proceeded to the nearby cemetery, where they found Wilson Wakelin's lifeless body atop the grave of his first wife. In a horrific act of despair, he had used the same razor to inflict fatal cuts on himself, severing the jugular veins on both sides of his neck. To ensure his own death, he had also taken a revolver and shot himself in the right temple. No additional notes or explanations were discovered, leaving many to ponder the motives behind his actions. Wakelin and Mary had been married for approximately 6 to 8 years, both having entered the union after previous marriages. Over the years, whispers of their discontent had circulated within the community, but Wilson had never exhibited any signs of insanity. The evidence suggested that he acted with cold deliberation, as both the razor and the revolver were found next to him in the cemetery. In the aftermath, the coroner conducted an investigation, ultimately returning a verdict that echoed the grim facts of the case. As of this morning, no funeral arrangements had been announced for either Mary or Wilson. The scene at the Wakelin residence was haunting. There were no indications of a struggle, and Mrs. Wakeland lay on her bed in a manner that suggested she had simply fallen asleep, save for the unnatural pallor of her skin. Given her prolonged illness, she had been in a weakened physical state, which added another layer of tragedy to this already heart-wrenching story. 3. The Stillwell murder. Amos and Fanny Stillwell returned home from a neighbor's party on December 29, 1889. The gathering featured members of Hannibal, Missouri's high society, with the Stillwells being among the wealthiest and most notable attendees. Mr. Stillwell began to feel weary around 11:30, prompting the couple to leave and take the short walk back to their home. They had entrusted their 3 young children to 2 servant girls, whom Mrs. Stillwell later dismissed, taking the children upstairs with her. The Stillwells slept in separate beds, and that night, Mrs. Stillwell shared her bed with the children. Their 14-year-old daughter, Molly, typically slept in the room next door, but was visiting friends that evening. Around 2 a.m., Mrs. Stillwell was roused by a disturbance and heard her husband calling out, "Fanny, is that you? Fanny, is that you?" She noticed a man standing with his back to her, and moments later she heard a whirring sound, as if something had been hurled violently through the air. Then she heard footsteps racing down the stairs. Rushing to her husband's bed, she discovered that he had been murdered. He had a deep gash in his head and was lying in a pool of blood. From that point on, Mrs. Stillwell's recollection of the events became hazy. She took the screaming children back to the servants and then ran outside in her nightgown to her neighbors, the Leagues. Mr. League listened to her frantic account and quickly called for doctors Hearn, Allen, and Gleason, who lived nearby. Meanwhile, in the bedroom, Mrs. Stillwell had fainted and remained unconscious while the doctors examined her husband's body. He had been struck with an axe, resulting in a wound so severe that it severed both his jugular vein and carotid artery. Recognizing that nothing could be done for Mr. Stillwell, Dr. Hearn focused on reviving Mrs. Stillwell. As her advising physician, he was able to bring her back to consciousness. The police examined the crime scene and concluded that the killer had exited through the back door, crossed the yard, and fled into an alley. During his escape, he dropped a $5 bill, which was discovered in the alley. Further along, investigators found 4 additional $5 bills and, a bit farther, an empty pocketbook. They also located the murder weapon, an old double-edged axe, in the alley. The police believed the intruder initially intended to commit burglary, but ended up killing Mr. Stillwell to avoid being identified. The murder of a prominent citizen stirred great excitement in Hannibal, and there was a strong desire to apprehend the killer. The Pinkerton Detective Agency was brought in to assist local law enforcement, and Richard Stillwell, Amos's son from his first marriage, offered a $1,000 reward for the capture of the murderer, attracting amateur detectives to the case. While Richard and the family were convinced that the killer was a burglar caught in the act, many in Hannibal speculated that Amos had been murdered by someone closer to home. 65-year-old Amos Stillwell owned a successful pork packing business and was one of the wealthiest men in Hannibal. After the death of his first wife over 20 years prior, he met Fanny Anderson during a visit to relatives in Indiana. Although she was still in her teens, Amos fell deeply in love with Fanny and proposed to her. Fanny had a strained relationship with her stepmother and had considered entering a convent. Ultimately, she decided that marrying a wealthy widower was more appealing than a life devoted to the church, and she accepted Amos's proposal. The Stillwells seemed to have a happy marriage, but Amos was aging, while Fanny, 30 years his junior, was still in her prime. Amos could be difficult to live with. He ran the household like a business and despised waste and unnecessary spending. A vegetarian and health enthusiast, he insisted that Fanny wear a heavy cotton nightgown, dismissing modern lacy styles as unhealthy. Although Amos didn't trust doctors, Fanny frequently consulted Dr. Joseph C. Hearn, who lived just around the corner. This led to speculation that they were having an affair, particularly after the murder, when many outside official circles suspected Dr. Hearn's involvement. Despite public sentiment, Richard Stillwell was determined to drive the investigation forward, maintaining the theory that the murder was a burglary. Detectives initially focused on the African-American community, and 2 weeks after the murder, they arrested George Gibson and his mistress, Alice Ward. The police did not disclose what evidence led to their arrest, but the couple underwent intense questioning by 2 Pinkerton agents. On January 28th, another black man, George Dixon, and his white mistress were also arrested by Pinkertons for unlawful cohabitation. Dixon was questioned about the murder after being seen in the city that night with an unusually large sum of money. However, there was insufficient evidence to hold any of the suspects, and they were quickly released. With no promising leads, the Pinkertons withdrew from the investigation, and the case went cold. Nearly a year after the murder, in December, Fanny Stillwell married Dr. Joseph C. Hearn. This rekindled interest in the case, and rumors about Dr. Hearn's involvement resurfaced. John E. Stillwell, the nephew of the murdered man, attempted to push for a thorough grand jury investigation that included Dr. Hearn, but the prosecuting attorney refused to consider anything beyond robbery. The grand jury did not issue any indictments, and the widow, now known as Fanny Hearn, forced John Stillwell's retirement from the pork packing company. Richard Stillwell raised the reward to $10,000, and over the next 4 years, a few arrests seemed promising, but ultimately led to no significant breakthroughs. The grand jury convened at least 5 more times, yet after reviewing the evidence, they issued no indictments. The Hearns eventually left Hannibal for San Diego, California, where Dr. Hearn opened a medical practice. In August 1894, Fanny Hearn filed for divorce, citing cruelty and failure to provide as her reasons. The decision was mutual, and Dr. Hearn did not contest the charges, though he privately attributed the split to incompatibility. After the divorce, Fanny reverted to her previous married name, Stillwell. News of the divorce reached as far as California, reigniting memories of the Stillwell murder. An article in the San Francisco Chronicle linked Dr. Hearn to the crime, infuriating him to the point that he sued the paper for libel, seeking $200,000 in damages. In July 1895, Dr. Hearn returned to Hannibal with his attorneys and representatives from the Chronicle to give depositions. This was not an opportune time for Dr. Hearn's return. Richard Stillwell had finally abandoned the burglary theory and accepted what many in the town had believed from the start, that his father had been murdered by Dr. Hearn and Fanny. He gathered evidence on his own and canceled the reward to avoid influencing the trial when he brought the case to court. Additionally, he volunteered to testify in support of the San Francisco Chronicle. Richard Stillwell explained his change of heart by stating that he had recently learned from multiple sources that Dr. Hearn and Fanny had been in love prior to the murder and had engaged in a secret affair. He discovered that Dr. Hearn believed Amos Stillwell was unworthy of Fanny and intended to use his influence to facilitate a divorce. Hearn was reportedly heard saying he could pay someone $2.50 to slug Amos. One of Richard's informants, Mrs. C.P. Haywood, claimed that Hearn had been at the Stillwell home while Amos was away in St. Louis. When Amos unexpectedly returned, Hearn, who had been naked, managed to hide in the shadows, passing Amos in the hall without being seen. Hearn allegedly told Mrs. Haywood that had he been caught, he would have shot Amos, and everyone would assume it was a burglary. No one would suspect doctors or ministers. A few days later, the grand jury reconvened and heard testimony from all the witnesses who had spoken for the San Francisco Chronicle, including Richard Stillwell, who provided a deposition from Mrs. C.P. Haywood. They also heard new incriminating evidence. Molly Stillwell had never slept away from home until the night of the murder. Witnesses believed Amos's body had been moved before they arrived. Several people reported seeing Fanny in a modern nightgown after the murder, and former detective Jim Abbey found a plain cotton nightgown with bloodstains in an outhouse on the Stillwell property. Ultimately, the grand jury indicted both Dr. Hearn and Fanny Stillwell for first-degree murder, leading to their arrests and holding them for trial. The defendants were to be tried separately, with Dr. Hearn's trial commencing in Bowling Green, Missouri, on December 9, 1895. The people of Hannibal anticipated justice after 7 long years. However, after 2 weeks of testimony, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty, citing insufficient hard evidence to link Dr. Hearn to the murder. He was immediately released from custody, while Fanny Stillwell was released on $5,000 bail. The verdict effectively cleared her as well, and she would never face charges in the murder case. The trial yielded few answers. Dr. Hearn and Fanny Stillwell continued to be viewed as the primary suspects in the eyes of the public. The residents of Hannibal remained outraged that one of their most prominent citizens could be murdered without any form of justice. 4. The Moa Creek murder. On September 28, 1949, a tragic event unfolded in Moa Creek, situated in the picturesque region of central Otago, New Zealand. The lifeless body of a 62-year-old man named William Peter McIntosh was discovered in the wool shed on his property. McIntosh, a devoted husband and father of grown children, was well regarded in the community, making the news of his death even more shocking. According to testimony provided by his wife during the subsequent inquest, McIntosh had left their home early that afternoon to tend to his farm duties. Before departing, he informed her that he would be back in time to catch a highly anticipated radio broadcast of a rugby match starting at 3 p.m. However, as the hours passed, it became clear that he would not return. Concerned, around 7 p.m., Mrs. McIntosh reached out to a nearby neighbor to report that her husband was missing. A search was quickly organized, and by approximately 8 p.m., the search party made a grim discovery. They found McIntosh's body in the wool shed, and the evidence of foul play was unmistakable. His head had been brutally bludgeoned with a heavy object, likely an axe that belonged to him. Although the axe was located later, the bloodstains on it were too faint for forensic experts to determine whether they were human. Further complicating the investigation, Mrs. McIntosh recalled an unsettling encounter shortly after her husband left for the farm. She heard the sound of the gate clicking shut and noticed a stranger approaching the back door. The man inquired about the location of a nearby resident. However, this individual never reached the intended destination, raising suspicions about his presence. Despite extensive police investigations, which included interviews with neighbors and residents, no one had seen any unfamiliar faces in the area on that fateful afternoon. The person that the stranger was searching for could not identify him either. Adding to the mystery, McIntosh was known to have had no enemies in the community, which made the motive for such a violent act even more perplexing. In an effort to solve the case, the government offered a substantial reward of £500 for any information, leading to the capture of the murderer. Despite these measures and the diligent work of law enforcement, the identity of McIntosh's killer remained elusive. The case, shrouded in mystery and tragedy, left the community grappling with fear and uncertainty, as the chilling question of who could commit such a heinous act lingered in the air. 5. Sophia Maria Ewall, a Swedish woman judged for 2 murders and for the murder of her father. Sophia Maria, born in 1826, was the eldest daughter of Per Ludvig Ewall, who was the son of statesman Christopher Retzius Ewall. Per was a wealthy man known for his honesty, but also for his depressive nature. In 1844, he moved with his wife, Hedvig Christina, and their 6 children to the Attarp Manor in Småland, located south of Linköping in Östergötland. On Wednesday, May 28, 1845, Ewall fell ill. He appeared to recover the following day, but his condition worsened after 8 days, leaving him bedridden. Shortly thereafter, the maid, Maja-Stina Forsberg, and one of the younger daughters also became ill. That same night, Forsberg passed away. A doctor was called and determined that the illness was caused by poisoning, administering an antidote to Ewall and the child. An autopsy on Forsberg confirmed she had been poisoned. Although Ewall's condition initially improved, he fell ill again after consuming a cup of oat soup and died that same night. Fortunately, the child made a full recovery. Following her husband's death, Hedvig Christina accused the maid, Hedda Thorman, of murdering Ewall. She alleged that Thorman had secretly given birth to a child and, with Forsberg's help, had killed it, subsequently killing Forsberg to cover her tracks. This raised the question of how both Ewall and his daughter had ingested the poison. Thorman was interrogated, but there was little evidence to suggest she was responsible for Ewall's murder. However, she was arrested on separate charges related to the alleged murder of her newborn. Concurrently, 18-year-old Willem Ewall, Per's son, was also arrested, suspected of being the father of Thorman's supposed child, and he emerged as a potential suspect in his father's murder. It was determined that Ewall had been poisoned by the soup he consumed, which had been prepared by Hedvig Christina Ewall. Maja-Stina Forsberg had eaten the leftovers from the pot, and Ewall's young daughter had also eaten from her father's plate. The police uncovered that Sophia Maria, the eldest daughter, had ordered arsenic from the apothecary, claiming it was for removing stains from her silk dress. As a result, Wilhelm Ewall was released from jail. An investigation into the Ewall family's daily life revealed that Per Ewall had been an alcoholic and a domestic abuser. He had denied his daughter Sophia Maria permission to marry her fiancé, which was believed to be the motive behind her decision to poison him. Maya Stina Forsberg and the child were thought to have been poisoned accidentally. Consequently, Sophia Maria was arrested for her father's murder. After spending some time in jail, Sophia Maria confessed that she had prepared a poisoned sandwich in the presence of her mother and given it to Maya Stina Forsberg with her mother's consent. However, she denied that her mother had played an active role in the murders. Hedvig Christina Ewall was questioned, and more incriminating evidence began to accumulate against her. Despite this, she consistently denied any involvement and was allowed to remain free to care for her children. Later, Sophia Maria retracted her original statement, accusing her mother of being an active accomplice in the murders. She claimed that both she and her mother had conspired to kill her father. In response, Hedvig Christina vehemently denied her daughter's allegations and criticized Sophia Maria for attempting to shift the blame onto her. Continuing her confession, Sophia Maria claimed that her mother had poisoned the soup, leading to her father's illness and Forsberg's death. She asserted that she had poisoned the oat soup that ultimately caused her father's demise after he had begun to recover from the initial poisoning. Hedvig Christina Ewall steadfastly refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing. Despite the numerous accusations, statements, and incriminating evidence presented against her, she maintained her denial. Lacking physical evidence, she was ultimately released. Hedda Thorman, who had initially confessed to secretly giving birth to and then killing an infant, later retracted her statement during her imprisonment and was also set free. Authorities now suspected that Sophia Maria was responsible for the crime. Sophia Maria Ewall was found guilty of murdering her father and Maya Stina Forsberg, resulting in a death sentence. However, after appealing to the King of Sweden for clemency, her sentence was commuted to 28 days of bread and water, followed by life imprisonment. She was finally released from prison in 1876. Meanwhile, Hedvig Christina Ewall continued to reside at Torp Manor until 1849.